They called her the quiet one in boardroom meetings. The one who always sat in the corner, taking notes while men in expensive suits made decisions about her department's future. They saw her worn-out shoes, her modest clothes from discount stores, her hesitation when speaking up in meetings. What they didn't see was the fire burning behind her tired eyes. Sarah Chen had been cleaning office buildings at night to support her family while working her day job for 12 years. She had watched countless promotions pass her by, seen her ideas stolen and presented by colleagues who earned 3 times her salary.
But on a cold Tuesday morning in March, everything would change. The company was hemorrhaging money.
Layoffs were coming. The executives were panicking. And in their desperation, they would finally listen to the woman they had ignored for over a decade. What happened next would shock everyone who had ever underestimated her.
This is the story of how Sarah Chen went from being the overlooked employee in the corner to saving an entire company, transforming thousands of lives, and proving that sometimes the most powerful victories come not from fighting back, but from rising above. Her triumph didn't come through confrontation or revenge.
It came through something far more devastating to those who had dismissed her: undeniable, extraordinary success. Some said it was luck. Others called it a miracle. But those who truly knew Sarah understood the truth. This was simply what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and when a brilliant mind finally gets the chance to shine. Sarah Chen's alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m. just like it had every morning for the past 12 years. She rolled out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her husband David, who wouldn't start his shift at the loading dock until 7 a.m. Their small apartment in Queens felt even smaller in the pre-dawn darkness, cramped with the evidence of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Sarah prepared for another 18-hour day. First, she would head to Manhattan Trust Financial, where she worked as a mid-level analyst in the risk management department. Then, after her official workday ended at 6 p.m., she would grab a quick dinner from a street cart and head to her night job cleaning office buildings in Midtown. She wouldn't return home until well past midnight, only to repeat the cycle again. Sarah had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan 15 years earlier, with a master's degree in mathematics and dreams of building a career in finance. Those dreams had been systematically crushed by a combination of subtle discrimination, economic necessity, and what her colleagues perceived as her lack of assertiveness. What they mistook for weakness was actually exhaustion from working 2 jobs to support not only herself and David, but also her elderly mother who lived with them and required expensive medication not covered by insurance. At Manhattan Trust, Sarah occupied a gray cubicle on the 14th floor, surrounded by analysts who were predominantly young, white, and male. Most had graduated from Ivy League schools their parents had paid for. They lived in trendy Brooklyn neighborhoods and spent their lunch hours discussing weekend trips to the Hamptons or their latest cryptocurrency investments. Sarah spent her lunch hours walking to the public library, where she could research financial trends and market analysis in silence, teaching herself advanced concepts that her formal education in Taiwan hadn't covered. Her supervisor, Brad Morrison, was a Harvard Business School graduate who had been with the company for 5 years. 3 years less than Sarah. He had been promoted twice in that time, while Sarah remained in the same position she had started in 8 years earlier. Brad had a habit of interrupting Sarah during meetings, often rephrasing her suggestions and presenting them as his own ideas. When clients called with complex questions, Brad would quietly forward them to Sarah's desk, then take credit for the thorough responses she provided. The other analysts treated Sarah with polite indifference. They invited her to office happy hours out of obligation, knowing she would decline due to her night job. They stopped including her in informal brainstorming sessions, assuming she had nothing valuable to contribute. Sarah had learned to speak more softly in meetings after a colleague once commented that her accent made it hard to follow her points. She began triple-checking her emails for grammar errors after another colleague forwarded one of her messages to the team with corrections highlighted in red. Despite the daily microaggressions and dismissive treatment, Sarah found genuine satisfaction in her work. Numbers didn't lie or play favorites. Market trends didn't care about her accent or where she bought her clothes. In the quiet hours before her colleagues arrived each morning, she would analyze risk portfolios with a precision that bordered on artistry. She could spot potential problems in investment strategies that others missed, identify opportunities in market volatility that seemed chaotic to less trained eyes. Sarah had tried to share her insights during team meetings, but her suggestions were often met with skeptical looks or quickly dismissed. When she proposed a comprehensive review of the company's exposure to subprime mortgage derivatives in 2019, Brad had smiled condescendingly and explained that, We have experts handling the complex stuff. When her analysis of emerging market currencies proved accurate 6 months later, saving the company from significant losses, the success was attributed to team effort in the quarterly report. The cleaning job at night was a different kind of challenge. Sarah worked for a contracted service that maintained office buildings throughout Midtown Manhattan. She would arrive at the first building by 8 p.m., change into comfortable clothes and work boots, and spend the next 6 hours vacuuming carpets, emptying trash cans, sanitizing bathrooms, and wiping down conference tables where people made decisions about millions of dollars. There was something oddly therapeutic about the work. After days filled with dismissive colleagues and stolen credit, the cleaning job offered honest labor with immediate visible results. A dirty floor became clean. A cluttered conference room became organized. No one questioned her competence or suggested she wasn't qualified for the task. During her cleaning rounds, Sarah often worked in the same buildings where other financial firms operated. She would see evidence of their late-night strategy sessions in the whiteboards covered with calculations, the coffee cups left behind after marathon planning meetings, the printed reports left in recycling bins that contained insights into how other companies approached risk management. Sarah never violated privacy or ethics, but she observed patterns in how successful firms operated differently from her own company. The physical demands of working 18 hours a day were taking their toll. Sarah's back ached constantly, from leaning over desks and conference tables. Her hands were dry and cracked from cleaning chemicals, despite the gloves she wore. She had developed a persistent cough from the dust and chemical fumes, but couldn't afford to take time off to see a doctor. David worried about her health, but they both knew the night job was what kept them afloat financially. Sarah's mother, Wei Ming, had been a mathematics professor in Taiwan before developing early-stage dementia. She required daily medication that cost nearly $800 per month, even with insurance. The alternative was watching her mother's condition deteriorate rapidly, something Sarah couldn't bear to consider. Wei Ming had sacrificed everything to give Sarah the education that brought her to America. Now it was Sarah's turn to sacrifice for family. The other cleaning crew members came from similarly challenging circumstances. Maria was supporting 3 children after her husband was deported. James was paying off crushing student loan debt from a master's degree that hadn't led to the career he expected. They formed an unlikely support network, sharing encouraging words during long nights and looking out for each other's safety in empty office buildings. What Sarah's day job colleagues didn't know was that she had been quietly building an impressive track record of accurate market predictions. Every evening during her dinner break between jobs, she would update a detailed spreadsheet tracking her analysis of various financial instruments, currency fluctuations, and market trends. Over 3 years, her predictions had been accurate, 80 to 7% of the time, far better than most professional analysts at major firms. Sarah had also been developing a comprehensive risk assessment model in her spare time, working on it during subway rides between jobs and on weekends when exhaustion didn't completely overwhelm her. The model incorporated variables that traditional analysis often overlooked, including geopolitical factors, environmental considerations, and social media sentiment analysis. It was sophisticated work that would have impressed experts at any major financial institution, but none of her colleagues at Manhattan Trust knew about these achievements. They saw only what they expected to see: a quiet woman who wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, who spoke English with an accent, who declined social invitations, and seemed to lack ambition. They had no idea that Sarah's apparent lack of ambition was actually focused determination channeled toward keeping her family stable while building expertise that would eventually prove invaluable. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she spent her nights cleaning the offices of people who earned in bonuses what she made in several years of combined income from both jobs. But she had learned patience from her mother's teachings about perseverance, and she had learned resilience from years of being underestimated. Sarah understood that recognition might never come, but excellence was its own reward. As winter turned to spring in 24, Sarah had no idea that her company was heading toward a crisis that would finally provide the opportunity she had been unknowingly preparing for her entire career. The financial storm brewing would devastate Manhattan Trust and threaten thousands of jobs. But it would also create the perfect conditions for a quiet woman in the corner to step forward and demonstrate that sometimes the most overlooked people possess exactly the skills needed to solve impossible problems. The transformation was coming, though Sarah didn't know it yet. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring another 4:30 a.m. alarm, another day of being invisible at the office, and another night of honest work cleaning buildings while the city slept. What she couldn't anticipate was that her years of preparation, observation, and quiet competence were about to collide with desperate circumstances in a way that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who had ever underestimated what she was capable of achieving.
The first signs of trouble appeared on a Monday morning in early March when Sarah arrived at her cubicle to find Brad Morrison pacing nervously near the coffee machine, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his expensive tie askew. The quarterly reports had come in over the weekend, and the numbers were devastating.
Manhattan Trust had lost $42 million in the previous quarter, primarily due to a series of high-risk investments that had seemed promising 6 months earlier, but had collapsed spectacularly when several emerging market currencies crashed simultaneously. Sarah recognized the currencies immediately. They were the same ones she had flagged in her personal analysis as potentially volatile due to political instability and environmental factors that traditional models didn't adequately account for. She had even mentioned her concerns to Brad during a team meeting in October, but he had dismissed her observations as overthinking and reminded her to focus on her assigned portfolio reviews rather than playing amateur economist.
Now, those same currency fluctuations had cost the company enough money to fund Sarah's combined salary for over 300 years.
The bitter irony wasn't lost on her, but she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. Too many people's jobs were now at risk for vindication to feel anything but hollow. The atmosphere in the office became increasingly tense as news of the losses spread through the company. Senior executives held closed-door meetings that ran late into the evening. Support staff whispered nervously about potential layoffs. The company's stock price had dropped 18% since the quarterly announcement, and financial news outlets were beginning to question Manhattan Trust's stability and leadership competence. Richard Blackstone, the company's CEO, was a 62-year-old veteran of Wall Street who had built his reputation on aggressive growth strategies and bold market plays. He had joined Manhattan Trust 5 years earlier with promises to transform the mid-sized firm into a major player capable of competing with industry giants. His approach had initially succeeded, generating impressive profits and attracting high-profile clients, but the recent losses threatened to undo years of progress and put his own position in jeopardy. Blackstone called an emergency meeting for all department heads on Tuesday morning. Sarah wasn't invited, of course, but she could see through the glass conference room walls as Brad and the other managers filed in with grim expressions. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, and when it ended, Brad returned to the risk management department looking pale and shaken. The news he delivered to his team was sobering. The company needed to recover at least $30 million within the next 6 months or face massive layoffs and possible bankruptcy. Every department was being asked to identify cost-cutting measures and revenue-generating opportunities. The risk management team specifically was being tasked with developing new investment strategies that could generate high returns while minimizing exposure to further losses. It was an almost impossible challenge. The kind of returns needed to recover from such significant losses typically required taking exactly the sort of risks that had created the current crisis. Conservative investments wouldn't generate enough revenue quickly enough, but aggressive strategies could lead to even greater disasters. The team needed to find investment opportunities that offered exceptional returns with minimal risk, a combination that experienced analysts knew was rare in favorable market conditions and nearly impossible during periods of economic uncertainty.
Brad assigned different team members to research various sectors and investment instruments. Sarah was given the task of analyzing municipal bonds and government securities, investments so conservative and low yield that the assignment felt almost insulting.
While her colleagues researched cryptocurrency opportunities, international equity markets, and emerging technology stocks, Sarah was relegated to reviewing the financial equivalent of savings accounts. But Sarah approached her assignment with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything.
She began by researching not just current municipal bond offerings, but historical patterns of government debt, infrastructure spending cycles, and the relationship between municipal investments and broader economic trends. What she discovered surprised even her. What did they call available for?
As several major cities were preparing to issue bonds for infrastructure projects that would benefit from recently passed federal legislation providing matching funds for green energy and transportation improvements. The bonds would offer modest returns by themselves, but Sarah's analysis revealed that the infrastructure projects they funded would likely increase property values and business activity in ways that would create secondary investment opportunities.
More importantly, Sarah noticed that the timing of these bond issues coincided with federal budget cycles in a way that would provide unusual stability even during economic downturns. While corporate investments might suffer during a recession,
These particular municipal projects were backed by federal commitments that remained stable regardless of market conditions. Sarah spent her lunch hours at the public library researching the political and environmental factors that would affect these investments. She analyzed voting patterns in local elections, demographic trends in the cities involved, and environmental impact studies for the proposed projects. The picture that emerged was remarkably positive. These were investments that would provide steady returns while contributing to projects that would create jobs and improve communities. But Sarah's research revealed an even more significant opportunity. By combining certain municipal bonds with strategic positions in companies that would benefit from the infrastructure projects, it would be possible to create an investment portfolio that offered both immediate stability and long-term growth potential. The approach required sophisticated analysis of multiple interconnected factors, but it could generate the kinds of returns Manhattan Trust needed while maintaining much lower risk than traditional high-yield strategies. Sarah worked late into the night developing her analysis, staying at the office after her colleagues left, and continuing her research during breaks from her cleaning job. She created detailed projections showing how her proposed investment strategy could recover $25 million for the company over 18 months with minimal risk of loss. The strategy wasn't flashy or exciting, but it was mathematically sound and practically achievable. Meanwhile, her colleagues were struggling to find viable high-return opportunities. The cryptocurrency market was too volatile following recent crashes. International markets were unstable due to ongoing trade tensions and political uncertainty. Technology stocks were overvalued and vulnerable to correction.
Every promising opportunity seemed to carry risks that could make the company's situation even worse. Brad was becoming increasingly desperate as the deadline for presenting recovery strategies approached.
He had been promoted to his supervisory position based more on his networking ability and confident presentation style than his analytical skills, and the current crisis was exposing the limitations of his expertise. He began staying late at the office, making increasingly frantic phone calls to contacts at other firms, seeking investment ideas that might save his career along with the company. Sarah debated whether to share her municipal bond strategy with Brad. Her previous experiences suggested that he would either dismiss her ideas without proper consideration or present them as his own insights. But the potential consequences of remaining silent were too serious to ignore. Thousands of employees depended on Manhattan Trust for their livelihoods, including many people in support roles who earned modest salaries and couldn't easily find new jobs in a competitive market. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah requested a meeting with Brad. She prepared a concise presentation outlining her investment strategy, complete with detailed financial projections and risk analysis. She practiced her presentation multiple times, anticipating the skeptical questions and dismissive comments she had learned to expect from her supervisor. Brad agreed to meet with her for 15 minutes on Friday morning, clearly viewing the meeting as a formality rather than a genuine opportunity for input. When Sarah began explaining her municipal bond strategy, his initial reaction was exactly what she had predicted: polite disinterest mixed with barely concealed condescension. "Municipal bonds are pretty basic stuff, Sarah," he said, glancing at his phone while she spoke. "We need sophisticated strategies that can generate serious returns, not textbook investments that might make us a few $1,000s over several years." Sarah persisted, explaining how her approach could generate $25 million in recovery funds while providing stability that would protect against further losses. She showed him her research on federal matching funds, infrastructure spending cycles, and the secondary opportunities created by municipal development projects. Brad's attention gradually shifted from his phone to Sarah's presentation as the sophistication of her analysis became apparent. The strategy she had developed was far more complex and potentially profitable than he had initially realized. More importantly, it offered exactly what the company desperately needed: a path to recovery that didn't require taking catastrophic risks. But even as Brad began to understand the value of Sarah's work, his first instinct was to find ways to claim credit for her insights. He asked probing questions about her research methodology, ostensibly to better understand her approach, but actually to determine how he could present the strategy as his own development. Sarah recognized what was happening, but she also understood that her primary goal was helping the company recover, not receiving personal recognition. If Brad needed to present her strategy as his own idea in order to ensure it received serious consideration from senior management, she was prepared to accept that outcome. The meeting ended with Brad promising to incorporate Sarah's research into the comprehensive recovery plan he was developing for presentation to the executive team. Sarah left his office with mixed emotions: frustration at the familiar pattern of her work being appropriated, but hope that her strategy might actually be implemented regardless of who received credit. What Sarah didn't know was that Brad's other research efforts had been unsuccessful, and her municipal bond strategy was the only viable recovery plan he had found. Without her work, he would have nothing substantial to present to the executive team, and his own position would be in serious jeopardy. Over the weekend, Brad worked to integrate Sarah's research into a presentation he could deliver with confidence. He simplified some of her more complex analyses and added his own commentary about implementation strategies and timeline considerations. By Sunday evening, he had created what appeared to be a comprehensive recovery plan that could potentially save Manhattan Trust from financial disaster. But as Brad prepared for the most important presentation of his career, he remained unaware that Sarah had been developing additional strategies that went far beyond municipal bonds. Her months of quiet observation and analysis had generated insights into market inefficiencies and investment opportunities that could transform the company's entire approach to risk management and profit generation. The stage was being set for a confrontation between preparation and desperation, between quiet competence and confident presentation, between the woman everyone underestimated and the crisis that would finally reveal her true capabilities. The storm that had gathered around Manhattan Trust was about to provide the perfect conditions for Sarah Chen to step out of the shadows and demonstrate what she had been capable of all along. The boardroom on the 32nd floor of Manhattan Trust had witnessed countless important meetings over the years, but none quite like the emergency strategy session scheduled for Monday morning, March 18th. The mahogany table that dominated the room reflected the anxious faces of 12 department heads and senior executives who understood that their presentations today would determine not only the company's future, but their own career survival. Richard Blackstone entered the room at precisely 9 a.m., his usually commanding presence diminished by the weight of recent losses and mounting pressure from the board of directors. He had built his reputation on decisive leadership and bold strategies, but the current crisis demanded solutions that went beyond inspirational speeches and aggressive market plays. The company needed concrete, actionable plans that could generate significant returns without risking the additional catastrophic losses that would trigger bankruptcy proceedings. Brad Morrison sat near the middle of the table, his leather portfolio containing the presentation he had spent the weekend perfecting. Sarah's municipal bond strategy formed the foundation of his recovery plan, though he had restructured her analysis to emphasize his own strategic insights and implementation expertise. He felt confident in the material, but nervous about questions that might expose the limitations of his understanding of the more complex financial modeling Sarah had developed. The first three presentations were disasters. The marketing department proposed an expensive advertising campaign that would cost millions without guaranteeing any increase in client investments. The technology division suggested upgrading their trading systems at a cost that would exceed their entire annual budget. The business development team recommended pursuing high-net-worth clients who were already being aggressively courted by every major firm on Wall Street. Blackstone's patience was visibly wearing thin as each department head offered suggestions that would cost more money than they generated or relied on competitive advantages the company simply didn't possess. His responses became increasingly sharp, his questions more pointed, his body language more dismissive. The atmosphere in the room grew more tense with each failed presentation. When Brad's turn arrived, he stood with practiced confidence and began delivering his recovery strategy with the polished presentation style that had carried him through previous challenges. He outlined the municipal bond opportunity with appropriate enthusiasm, explaining how federal matching funds would enhance returns and provide stability during market uncertainty. The initial response was cautiously positive. Several executives nodded approvingly as Brad described the potential for steady, reliable returns that would contribute to recovery without introducing additional risk. But as he continued his presentation, the questions became more sophisticated and technical than he had anticipated. What's the correlation coefficient between infrastructure spending and local economic growth in the specific municipalities you're targeting? Asked Jennifer Walsh, the chief financial officer. Brad hesitated, realizing that this level of statistical analysis hadn't been included in his prepared remarks. The correlation is definitely positive, he said, trying to buy time while searching his memory for details from Sarah's research. I'd need to get back to you with the specific numbers. How did you account for political risk in local elections that might affect project funding? Pressed Marcus Thompson from the legal department. Again, Brad found himself without the detailed analysis necessary to provide a convincing answer. Sarah had researched voting patterns and political stability factors extensively, but he hadn't fully absorbed the complexity of her methodology. As the questions continued, it became increasingly apparent that Brad's understanding of his own presentation was superficial. He could discuss general concepts confidently, but lacked the deep analytical foundation necessary to defend his strategy against expert scrutiny. His responses became more vague and evasive, his confidence visibly eroding with each question he couldn't answer adequately. Blackstone finally interrupted the increasingly awkward exchange. Brad, it's clear you've done some interesting preliminary research, but this presentation lacks the depth of analysis we need for a recovery strategy of this magnitude. The basic concept might have merit, but we need someone who truly understands the complexities involved to develop it into a viable implementation plan. The implication was clear. Brad's presentation had failed to provide the sophisticated solution the company desperately needed. As he returned to his seat with his reputation damaged and his job security in jeopardy, the meeting continued with presentations from other departments that proved equally inadequate to the crisis at hand.
By 11:30 a.m., Blackstone had heard recovery strategies from every department head, and none had provided a convincing path forward. The proposals ranged from impractical to potentially disastrous, with nothing approaching the comprehensive solution needed to restore the company's financial stability.
The CEO's frustration was evident as he contemplated the possibility of announcing massive layoffs and potential bankruptcy proceedings to the board of directors. During a coffee break, Jennifer Walsh approached Brad with a direct question that would change everything.
The municipal bond analysis in your presentation was sophisticated work, but your answers to our questions suggest you didn't develop it yourself. Who actually did the research? Brad's first instinct was to deflect the question or claim collaborative development, but Walsh's expression made it clear that evasive answers would only make his situation worse.
After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he admitted that Sarah Chen had developed the core analysis and financial modeling.
Sarah Chen from your risk management team? Walsh asked, clearly surprised. The woman who's been with the company for 8 years and never been promoted? Yes. But she just did some preliminary research, Brad said, trying to minimize Sarah's contribution.
I developed the overall strategy and implementation framework. Walsh exchanged glances with Marcus Thompson, who had overheard the conversation. Both executives were experienced enough to recognize the difference between original analysis and repackaged presentation.
They had seen Brad's work before and knew that the sophisticated financial modeling they had questioned was beyond his typical capabilities. When the meeting reconvened, Walsh made an unexpected request. Richard, I think we should hear directly from the person who developed the municipal bond analysis. Brad has indicated that Sarah Chen from Risk Management did the core research, and I'd like her to address some of the technical questions we raised.
Blackstone looked surprised. He knew Sarah by name, but had rarely interacted with her directly.
In his mental picture of the company's key personnel, she remained in the background. Someone who attended meetings but rarely spoke up, whose contributions seemed limited to routine analytical tasks. You want to bring in a mid-level analyst? He asked, clearly uncertain about the precedent this might set.
The analysis we saw was extremely sophisticated, Walsh replied firmly. If she developed it, she might have insights that could help us determine whether this approach is actually viable for our recovery needs.
After brief consultation with Thompson and 2 other senior executives, Blackstone agreed to the unusual request.
Sarah was summoned from her cubicle to the 32nd floor boardroom, arriving 15 minutes later in her standard office attire. A dark blue blazer she had purchased 3 years earlier, a modest skirt and shoes that were comfortable for her long days but hardly fashionable by executive standards. The contrast between Sarah and the other meeting participants was immediately apparent.
While they wore expensive suits and accessories that broadcast their professional success, Sarah looked exactly like what she was. A hardworking employee who earned a modest salary and had more pressing financial priorities than wardrobe upgrades. But when Sarah entered the boardroom and took the seat indicated by Blackstone, something in the atmosphere shifted. There was a focused intensity in her manner that hadn't been visible in the casual office environment where she was typically overlooked. This was someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity, even though she hadn't known when or if it might arrive.
Walsh began by asking Sarah to explain the methodology behind the municipal bond analysis that had formed the foundation of Brad's presentation. Sarah's response was immediate, detailed, and delivered with quiet confidence that grew stronger with each technical question she answered accurately and comprehensively.
The correlation coefficient between infrastructure spending and local economic growth varies by municipality size and project type, she began. But in the specific cities I analyzed, the 18-month correlation averages 0.73, with higher coefficients for transportation projects and lower ones for general municipal improvements. She continued without notes, explaining her analysis of federal matching fund requirements, political stability factors, environmental impact considerations, and demographic trends that would affect long-term project viability. Her responses revealed not only deep understanding of the immediate investment opportunity, but comprehensive research into dozens of related factors that would determine success or failure. As Sarah spoke, The executives around the table began to realize that they were hearing analysis far more sophisticated than anything in Brad's presentation. This wasn't preliminary research that had been developed into a strategy by someone else. This was comprehensive, original thinking that demonstrated expertise they hadn't known existed within their own company.
Blackstone leaned forward in his chair, his attention completely focused on Sarah for the first time in their 8 years of working for the same company. Sarah, what kind of returns do you project from this municipal bond strategy over 18 months? The conservative projection is $24 million in net returns, Sarah replied without hesitation. The optimistic scenario, assuming all federal matching funds are approved and local elections maintain current leadership, could reach $31 million. But I should mention that the municipal bond approach is just one component of what I believe could be a much more comprehensive recovery strategy.
The room fell completely silent. Sarah had just suggested that her analysis extended beyond the strategy that had consumed Brad's entire presentation.
If municipal bonds were merely one component of her thinking, what other opportunities had she identified? Walsh was the first to break the silence.
What other components are you referring to, Sarah? Sarah took a breath, understanding that this moment would define not only her own future, but potentially the future of everyone employed by Manhattan Trust. For 8 years, she had watched her insights be dismissed, her contributions minimized, her potential ignored.
Now, facing the company's most serious crisis, she finally had the opportunity to demonstrate what she had been capable of all along. I've identified 17 different investment opportunities that could work together to generate the returns we need, while maintaining acceptable risk levels, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction.
The municipal bonds provide stability and steady growth, but there are also opportunities in renewable energy infrastructure, demographic-driven real estate trends, and currency arbitrage that could accelerate our recovery significantly. The executives exchanged glances around the table, beginning to understand that they might have been overlooking their most valuable analyst for nearly a decade.
The woman they had barely noticed was about to present solutions that could save their company and their careers. The transformation was beginning, though none of them fully grasped yet how completely Sarah Chen was about to change their understanding of what was possible when preparation, opportunity, and quiet determination finally converged in perfect circumstances.
The silence in the boardroom stretched for nearly 30 seconds as the full implications of Sarah's statement settled over the assembled executives. 17 different investment opportunities. A comprehensive recovery strategy that went far beyond anything they had previously considered. The quiet woman who had been invisible for 8 years was claiming to have solutions that could save Manhattan Trust from financial disaster. Richard Blackstone was the first to recover from his surprise. Sarah, you're saying you've developed a complete recovery plan that could generate the returns we need? Yes, sir, Sarah replied with calm certainty. I've been working on it during my personal time for the past 6 months, updating the analysis as market conditions changed. The municipal bonds that Mr. Morrison presented are the foundation because they provide stability, but the real opportunity comes from layering additional strategies that complement each other while maintaining overall risk at acceptable levels. Jennifer Walsh leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense interest.
Can you give us an overview of these 17 opportunities? Sarah had been preparing for this moment without knowing it would ever come. Every lunch hour spent researching at the public library. Every late night spent updating her analysis between cleaning jobs. Every weekend spent refining her calculations. Had led to this opportunity to finally demonstrate her capabilities.
The strategy has 4 main components, Sarah began, her confidence growing as she moved into territory where she knew her expertise was unquestionable. First, the municipal infrastructure investments we discussed, which provide stable returns and federal backing. Second, renewable energy projects that benefit from recent legislation and changing consumer preferences. Third, demographic arbitrage opportunities in real estate markets that are undervalued due to temporary factors. Fourth, currency positioning that takes advantage of predictable fluctuations tied to international trade patterns. She paused, gauging the room's reaction before continuing. Each component works independently, but they also strengthen each other. The infrastructure investments create jobs in specific regions, which drives demand for housing and commercial real estate in those same areas. The renewable energy projects benefit from both federal subsidies and the infrastructure improvements that make them more viable. The currency positions hedge against risks in the other investments while generating returns from international trade flows. Marcus Thompson from Legal raised his hand. Sarah, this sounds extremely complex to implement and monitor. How do you propose managing 17 different investment streams simultaneously? The complexity is in the analysis, not the implementation, Sarah explained.
Most of these investments can be structured as index funds or partnership agreements that don't require daily management.
I've identified specific vehicles that already exist in the market, along with a few opportunities where we would need to create partnerships with other firms. The key is understanding how they interact with each other, which allows us to optimize timing and allocation to maximize returns while minimizing risk.
Blackstone was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The woman his company had overlooked for nearly a decade had developed analysis that surpassed anything produced by their senior leadership team. Sarah, what kind of returns are you projecting from this comprehensive approach? Conservative estimates show $47 million in net returns over 18 months, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the numbers she was presenting. Optimistic projections, assuming favorable conditions across all components, could reach $63 million.
Even in worst-case scenarios where several components underperform, the strategy should still generate at least $35 million, which would be sufficient for company stabilization and selective expansion. The room erupted in excited murmurs as executives realized that Sarah was proposing not just recovery, but potentially the most successful period in Manhattan Trust's history.
Returns of $60 million would not only solve their current crisis, but position them to compete with much larger firms and pursue growth opportunities that had previously been beyond their reach. Walsh was already thinking about implementation challenges.
Sarah, developing this analysis is impressive, but executing a strategy of this complexity would require significant resources and expertise. Do you have experience managing investments at this scale? This was the question Sarah had been dreading, because it exposed the gap between her analytical capabilities and her practical experience.
She had never managed more than the modest portfolios assigned to her current position. Her expertise was theoretical and mathematical, not operational.
I don't have direct experience managing investments at this scale, Sarah admitted. But I've spent 3 years studying implementation strategies used by successful firms, and I've identified the specific partnerships and operational frameworks that would be needed to execute this approach effectively.
I believe we could structure the strategy to leverage external expertise for implementation while maintaining internal control over strategic decisions. Thompson leaned back in his chair, considering the implications.
You're talking about partnerships with other firms. That introduces counterparty risks and dilutes our control over outcomes.
Actually, the partnerships I've identified would enhance our position rather than weaken it, Sarah replied. Most of these are firms that specialize in specific investment types but lack the capital to pursue larger opportunities.
We would provide funding and strategic direction, while they contribute operational expertise and market access. The partnerships are structured to give us majority control while sharing risks and expertise. Sarah had spent months researching potential partners, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, analyzing their track records and financial stability. Her approach wasn't theoretical. It was based on detailed knowledge of specific firms and individuals who could contribute to Manhattan Trust's success.
As the questions continued, it became increasingly clear that Sarah had thought through every aspect of implementation with the same thoroughness she had applied to the investment analysis. She had identified potential obstacles and developed solutions, researched regulatory requirements and compliance issues, analyzed tax implications and accounting considerations.
Blackstone was beginning to realize that his company's salvation might depend on promoting and empowering the employee they had most consistently undervalued. Sarah, if we were to move forward with this strategy, what would you need to implement it successfully? A team of 3 additional analysts to help with monitoring and reporting. Sarah replied immediately, having anticipated this question.
Access to the advanced modeling software currently restricted to senior management. Authority to negotiate directly with potential partners, rather than working through multiple approval layers.
And a budget for travel to conduct due diligence meetings with firms we haven't worked with previously. These were reasonable requests that would cost the company perhaps $200,000 in additional expenses, while potentially generating returns that exceeded their investment by a factor of 300.
The mathematics of the proposal were compelling, but the executives were still grappling with the dramatic shift in their perception of Sarah's capabilities. Walsh posed the question that everyone was thinking. Sarah, why haven't you shared this level of analysis with us before?
If you've been capable of this kind of work for months or years, why are we just learning about it now? Sarah considered her response carefully, understanding that this moment would determine whether her breakthrough led to lasting change or temporary recognition.
She could offer diplomatic answers about waiting for the right opportunity or focusing on assigned responsibilities.
But the truth was more complex and more important for the executives to understand.
I've tried to share insights and analysis many times over the past 8 years, Sarah said quietly. Most suggestions were dismissed during meetings or incorporated into other people's presentations without attribution.
I learned that my ideas received more serious consideration when they came from colleagues who were seen as more credible or authoritative, so I focused on developing my analysis privately, hoping that eventually there would be an opportunity to demonstrate what I could contribute directly.
The implications of her statement were uncomfortable for everyone in the room. Sarah was politely explaining that she had been marginalized and undervalued, that her contributions had been systematically dismissed or appropriated, that the company had been wasting her potential for nearly a decade.
Brad Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that his treatment of Sarah's insights was being implicitly criticized in front of senior management. But his personal discomfort was insignificant compared to the broader realization that Manhattan Trust had been failing to utilize their most capable analysts due to unconscious biases and organizational blind spots. Blackstone was experienced enough to understand that Sarah's diplomatic explanation revealed serious problems with the company's culture and decision-making processes. But he was also practical enough to focus on immediate solutions rather than past mistakes.
Sarah, if we give you the resources and authority you've described, how quickly could you begin implementing this recovery strategy? He asked. We could begin with the municipal bond investments within 2 weeks, Sarah replied. The renewable energy and real estate components would require 4 to 6 weeks for partnership negotiations and due diligence. The currency positions could be established immediately since they use existing trading platforms.
I estimate we could have the full strategy operational within 8 weeks, with measurable results visible within 4 months. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, offering hope that Manhattan Trust could begin recovering from their losses much sooner than anyone had previously believed possible. More importantly, Sarah was providing specific, actionable steps rather than vague promises or theoretical possibilities. Walsh made the decision that would change everything.
Richard, I recommend we authorize Sarah to proceed with immediate implementation of her recovery strategy. The analysis is sophisticated, the projections are realistic, and the timeline is acceptable. We have nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain. Thompson nodded in agreement.
I'll need to review the partnership agreements and regulatory compliance issues, but Sarah's approach appears sound from a legal perspective. I suggest we establish a dedicated team with Sarah as lead strategist and provide whatever resources she needs to succeed. One by one, the other executives voiced their support for giving Sarah the opportunity to prove her strategy in practice. The woman who had been invisible for 8 years was suddenly being entrusted with the company's future and provided with resources she had never dreamed of accessing.
Blackstone made the decision official. Sarah, you're hereby appointed as Senior Director of Strategic Recovery, reporting directly to me. You'll have budget authority for strategy implementation, hiring authorization for your support team, and my full backing to negotiate partnerships and execute your recovery plan.
The success or failure of Manhattan Trust may well depend on what you accomplish in the next 18 months. As the meeting adjourned and executives filed out of the boardroom, Sarah remained seated for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred.
After 8 years of being overlooked and underestimated, she had been given the opportunity she had unknowingly been preparing for her entire career. The transformation had begun, but the real challenge lay ahead. Sarah would now need to prove that her analytical brilliance could translate into practical success, that her carefully developed strategies could withstand the pressures of real-world implementation, and that the woman everyone had underestimated could indeed triumph without confrontation or revenge, but through the sheer power of undeniable competence and quiet determination. 18 months later, Sarah Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 35th floor of Manhattan Trust, watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and amber. The view from her new office was spectacular, but what filled her with quiet satisfaction wasn't the prestige of the executive floor or the mahogany desk that had once seemed impossibly luxurious. It was the knowledge that every prediction she had made during that pivotal boardroom meeting had not only proven accurate but had exceeded even her optimistic projections. The numbers spoke for themselves with mathematical certainty that allowed no room for doubt or diminishment.
Sarah's comprehensive recovery strategy had generated $68 million in net returns over 18 months, surpassing her most optimistic projections by $5 million. Manhattan Trust had not only recovered from its devastating losses, but had achieved the most profitable period in the company's 40-year history.
The municipal bond investments had performed exactly as Sarah had predicted, generating steady returns of 8.3% annually while providing the stability that allowed more aggressive components of the strategy to flourish. The renewable energy partnerships had benefited from both federal subsidies and unexpected technological advances that increased efficiency beyond projected levels.
The real estate investments had captured demographic trends perfectly, with property values in targeted markets increasing by an average of 23%, as infrastructure improvements attracted businesses and residents exactly as Sarah's analysis had predicted. But perhaps most impressively, the currency arbitrage positions had generated returns that astounded even experienced traders at major investment banks.
Sarah's understanding of international trade patterns and political factors had allowed her to anticipate currency fluctuations with remarkable precision, turning relatively small initial investments into millions of dollars in profits through careful timing and strategic positioning. The success had transformed not only Manhattan Trust's financial position, but its reputation within the industry.
Financial publications that had once questioned the company's competence now featured articles analyzing Sarah's innovative approach to risk management and integrated investment strategies. Competitors attempted to reverse engineer her methods, while clients who had been considering moving their accounts to larger firms instead increased their investments and referred new business.
Sarah's personal transformation had been equally dramatic but more carefully managed. She had negotiated an executive compensation package that reflected her contributions while remaining mindful of her family's long-term security rather than immediate luxury.
Her salary had increased by a factor of 12, but she had structured much of her compensation as deferred payments and equity stakes that would grow with the company's continued success. The first change Sarah had made with her increased income was hiring a full-time caregiver for her mother, a compassionate professional who spoke Mandarin and understood the specific challenges of caring for someone with early-stage dementia.
Wei Ming was now receiving the best possible medical care and therapeutic support. Her condition stabilized and her quality of life dramatically improved. Seeing her mother smile again and engage with daily activities had meant more to Sarah than all the professional recognition she had received. David had been able to leave his grueling job at the loading dock and return to school to complete the engineering degree he had abandoned years earlier due to financial pressures. He was now in his final semester, already fielding job offers from firms that had noticed his academic excellence and practical experience.
Their relationship had strengthened as financial stress diminished, and they could focus on supporting each other's dreams rather than simply surviving each day. Sarah had also quietly used her position and resources to help her former cleaning crew colleagues. Maria had been hired as an administrative assistant in Manhattan Trust's Human Resources Department, her bilingual skills and work ethic quickly earning her additional responsibilities and advancement opportunities. James had received a recommendation that helped him secure a financial analyst position at a smaller firm, where his graduate degree and determination finally received the recognition they deserved. The transformation of Manhattan Trust's culture had been subtler but equally significant. Sarah's success had forced the company's leadership to acknowledge the ways their unconscious biases had limited their ability to identify and develop talent. New policies were implemented to ensure more inclusive decision-making processes, more diverse hiring practices, and better recognition systems for employee contributions regardless of their source. Brad Morrison's career had followed a predictable trajectory after his presentation failures became widely known. He had accepted a lateral transfer to a smaller client services role, where his networking skills remained valuable, but his analytical limitations were less exposed. To his credit, he had approached Sarah privately to acknowledge his past treatment of her contributions and express genuine respect for her achievements. The conversation had been awkward but necessary for both of them to move forward professionally. Richard Blackstone had been promoted to chairman of the board, his leadership during the crisis earning recognition from industry peers and company shareholders. He had been generous in crediting Sarah's contributions to the company's recovery, using interviews and industry conferences to highlight the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging and listening to voices that might typically be overlooked.
But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from the opportunities she was now able to create for others. Her success had given her a platform to advocate for analytical approaches that prioritize long-term stability over short-term gains, for investment strategies that considered social and environmental impacts alongside financial returns, for workplace cultures that valued competence and contribution over networking and self-promotion.
She had established a mentorship program within Manhattan Trust that paired experienced analysts with junior employees from diverse backgrounds, ensuring that talented individuals wouldn't remain invisible the way she had for nearly a decade. The program had already identified several promising analysts whose insights had contributed to the company's continued success.
Sarah had also begun speaking at industry conferences and business schools, sharing not just her analytical methods but her perspective on the importance of persistence, preparation, and staying true to one's values even when recognition seems unlikely.
Her presentations always emphasized that her success had come not from confrontation or revenge against those who had underestimated her, but from maintaining focus on excellence and being ready when opportunity finally arrived. The speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities with other firms seeking to replicate Manhattan Trust's recovery success. Sarah had been selective about these projects, choosing to work only with companies that demonstrated genuine commitment to improving their organizational cultures, along with their financial performance. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for a meeting that held special significance. A group of recent MBA graduates from diverse backgrounds had requested mentorship guidance as they began their careers in finance.
The group included 2 women who had immigrated from Asia, a man who had grown up in poverty and worked his way through school, and a woman whose parents had never attended college. Sarah saw herself in each of their stories, talented individuals whose potential might be overlooked by colleagues and supervisors who made assumptions based on superficial characteristics rather than actual capabilities. She was determined to help them navigate early career challenges while developing the analytical skills and confidence that would eventually allow their contributions to become undeniable. The meeting began with Sarah sharing her own story, not to highlight her eventual success, but to acknowledge the frustrations and setbacks that preceded recognition.
She wanted them to understand that feeling underestimated and undervalued was a common experience for people from non-traditional backgrounds, but that these experiences could become sources of strength rather than discouragement. The most important thing I learned during my 8 years of being overlooked, Sarah told them, was that excellence is always noticed eventually, even when it takes longer than we hope or expect. The key is to keep developing your skills, keep doing your best work, and keep preparing for opportunities that might come when you least expect them. She shared specific strategies for building analytical capabilities, developing industry knowledge, and creating documentation of contributions that would be difficult for others to dismiss or appropriate. But she also emphasized the importance of maintaining integrity and focusing on solutions rather than problems, on building others up rather than tearing them down.
You'll face people who underestimate you. Sarah continued.
Some will do it unconsciously, others more deliberately. Your response should never be to lower your standards or compromise your values. Instead, use their underestimation as motivation to become so good at what you do that your competence becomes impossible to ignore. One of the mentees asked how Sarah had maintained hope during years of being overlooked. It was a question she had been expecting because she remembered how difficult it had been to stay motivated when recognition seemed unlikely.
I focused on the work itself rather than external validation, Sarah replied. I found genuine satisfaction in solving complex problems, in understanding market dynamics, in developing analyses that were mathematically elegant and practically useful. When you love the work itself, you can sustain effort and enthusiasm even when others don't recognize your contributions. She also emphasized the importance of building support networks with colleagues who shared similar values and challenges.
Sarah had learned that isolation made setbacks more difficult to overcome, while connection with like-minded individuals provided encouragement and perspective during difficult periods. As the mentorship meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed while her core values remained constant. She was still the same person who found satisfaction in analytical precision, who prioritized family obligations over personal advancement, who preferred substance over style in professional interactions. But now her voice carried weight when she spoke. Her ideas received serious consideration, and her success created opportunities for others who might otherwise remain invisible.
The transformation wasn't just personal. It had ripple effects that extended far beyond Manhattan Trust's financial results. Sarah's story had become a case study in business schools, highlighting the importance of inclusive leadership and the dangers of overlooking talent based on superficial characteristics.
Other companies had begun examining their own practices for identifying and developing analytical capabilities regardless of their source. Industry publications had featured articles about Sarah's integrated approach to risk management, leading to broader discussions about the benefits of considering multiple interconnected factors rather than analyzing investments in isolation. Her methods were being adopted by firms across the financial sector, contributing to more stable and sustainable investment practices. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's success had demonstrated that triumph could come through excellence rather than confrontation, through building rather than destroying, through proving capability rather than seeking revenge. She had shown that the most powerful response to being underestimated was not to fight back, but to rise so high that the view from the top made previous slights seem insignificant. As Sarah prepared to leave her office that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a cramped Queens apartment and 18-hour workdays to a corner office and industry recognition. The path had been longer and more difficult than she had hoped, but it had also been more meaningful and impactful than she had ever imagined possible. Her mother's condition was stable and comfortable. David was thriving in his engineering program. Her former cleaning crew colleagues were building careers that utilized their talents and determination. Manhattan Trust was stronger and more successful than ever. The mentorship program was helping talented individuals avoid the years of invisibility Sarah had experienced. Most importantly, Sarah had proven to herself and others that quiet competence, persistent preparation, and unwavering integrity could triumph over the loudest voices and most confident presentations. She had shown that sometimes the most underestimated people possess exactly the capabilities needed to solve the most challenging problems. The woman they had all underestimated had indeed triumphed, not by hitting back at those who had dismissed her, but by rising so far above their expectations that their previous blindness to her potential became irrelevant. Her victory was complete not because she had defeated anyone, but because she had succeeded so thoroughly that success itself became the most powerful response to every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked. In the end, Sarah Chen had discovered that the greatest triumph comes not from proving others wrong, but from proving yourself right. And in proving herself right, she had opened doors not only for her own future, but for countless others who had been waiting in the shadows for someone to show them that quiet excellence could indeed change everything.